Hey y'all, my name is Gabby, and I'm here to share my academic experience with you. Today, I wanted to talk about my time at Harvard. Um, it's kind of a conversation that I rarely talk to with people. I usually just kind of not necessarily brush it off, but I think there's just so much that sometimes just in passing I can't fully talk about. Just because, again, there's so much, and my own experience with Harvard as a graduate student was maybe not typical. But I just thought I'd take the time to share this video now. Um, I have decided to do this in 4 parts just because I think it might be easier that way, just because every semester was slightly different, and then there were some summers in between that were also pretty significant. But just kind of a background, I went to Harvard Divinity School. So within the Harvard University umbrella, you have like the law school and the med school. Well, you also have a school just for religion, and so that is the Divinity School. So it was a 2-year Master Theological Studies program, and it was really fun. I really enjoyed it. Um, I had originally wanted to go to the University of Chicago because I was like, oh, that's where all the religious studies people go. And well, I never applied. So I don't want to say Harvard was my last resort, but kind of. Um, I also did have a lot of help from my undergrad professors and even community college instructors, professors who were really supportive in that process. And of course, I had by then the grades. And if you watch an earlier video of mine, you'll see that the transition from undergrad, like back in 2008 to when I started the Div School fall 2016, I had done a complete 180-degree turn, and it was things were brand new for me or exciting, and I was feeling like I could academically or I could succeed academically or do well within this field. So I left uh, the West Coast with a good outlook. But I will also mention that right before that fall started, I broke up with the boyfriend I had at the time broke up with me, and I felt like my whole world had crashed. I don't think we often talk about breakups in grad school or like personal life like that in grad school. But I think that was really a difficult moment for me just because, again, I thought this was the person I was going to marry. I thought we were doing well. We had talked about me applying to Harvard. I hadn't dated him for that long. It was maybe 7 months by then, 8 months by then, um, maybe closer to seven. But so this wasn't a surprise for him, but he ultimately decided it was best and or best for him, or he understood his capacity. And at this point, having been so many years apart, um, almost 10 years now, I don't blame him. I know he's married now and he's living his best life, and I honestly wish him nothing but the best. And I think that I don't think this also gets talked about enough in academia. Sometimes we're forced to be in positions where we have to choose certain things. We have to sacrifice other things. And I think for me in that moment, it was, I could have chosen to defer a year, but I ultimately, actually, I talked to my friend about that, and she was like, no, don't do that. And I was like, okay. So I didn't. And honestly, I think it all worked out for the best. I don't regret it for a day, for a day. So I will say that because my fall, I guess this is part one. Uh, a fall semester was really, how do I say this? Because of that breakup, I can, viv I feel like I always say vividly, but I can distinctly remember during orientation weekend, I was just still crying. I was still in my feels. I was in between sessions. Um, I would just cry. Like I would find a place and I would just cry. I met a bunch of cool people in that during that weekend, and because it's orientation weekend, you're introduced to a bunch of people and that kind of stuff, and I just felt like my heart was not in it. I felt like I missed him so much, and I just wanted, you know things to go back to normal, and they didn't go back to normal. So um there was a lot of me having to deal with like that kind of emotion, in addition to like taking all these really interesting, cool classes. And I had to pull up my transcript because I was like, what classes did I take? But I think each semester I ended up taking one, two, three, four classes. That semester I took the theories and methods class. I also took one of my favorite professors that I ended up having this fall turned out to be like my mentor. And he was just amazing the whole time that I was there. But that was a biography class. And actually, that's kind of where my what ultimately became my research or dissertation topic. That's kind of where it started because I realized, one, I love life narratives, and number two, I realized that I could study someone's life through the lens of religion and or spirituality. Um, and number three, that the kinds of biographies, autobiographies, or memoirs that we looked at, um, many of them, I don't know if any of that particular syllabus, I don't think had any kind of like Latinx religious figures in there. And I was like, mm. So I kind of set out to, try to do something about that. Um, I also took an anthropology of the religious. Uh, that was supposed to be a part one. Well, it was a part one. There was supposed to be a part two to that, but I don't think that ever happened, because the professor who taught that class ended up leaving at the end of that fall quarter, so I never took it. But that I think was the harder class for me. And honestly, I don't even remember the paper I turned in for it, but I do remember. Um, I don't remember exactly why I had to finish a paper. I'm trying to remember the transition between fall and spring, but that class kind of really made me feel like I was dumb. It made me feel like I didn't know what was going on. It made me feel like I didn't know anything, and I wasn't going to sit there and say that I was an anthropologist because I wasn't. That's not my training. My training is mostly in history, and that was really, really challenging. I think I can't remember now. I have to go through some of this because I can't remember a lot. This is when people ask me how it was, this is part of it. Like I can't remember a big chunk of it, but I do remember certain moments. And it's so funny because I'll talk to people and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I remember you, saying this or doing that and da da da." And I'm just like, "Oh, I don't remember that." Um, but so yeah, fall semester was challenging in that it was a brand new space. I had never been to the East Coast. I don't think the furthest I'd gone was like Virginia, maybe, but that's different than Boston, East Coast, or at least the time that I was there, it was a bit different. Um, and I went without knowing anybody. I went without understanding anything about Boston. I didn't even know what New England was. I was like, what does that mean? um, I didn't know anything about it. Also, I don't know if I recommend this, but I ended up getting the cheapest thing I could find via Craigslist, and it was a room in a house, and that's what that was. That in and of itself was a maybe, I don't know if it deserves its own story time, just because it was a really not fun experience having to live with. I've lived with people before, but what I was told about the living situation was not what ended up being the reality of it. So that was really difficult. Um, but once I got there, I I just had to go to class and I had to learn how to take the bus. I had to learn how to take the train. Not that I hadn't learned that before, but in a brand new place that I had no idea, um, that was difficult. And in comparison to something like a UC Riverside, where I finished my undergrad, or, Northern California, where I finished well, I didn't finish anything. I got kicked out of that school. Um, those situations were different because I lived on campus or pretty close to campus, and by then I had a car or I could walk. But this was different because I lived in Hyde Park, which is just south of it's within Boston, but it's going further south. And so I had to take, there were different ways of getting there, but I would take the commuter rail, which I realized was not necessary. I would take the commuter rail to South Station and then to Harvard Square. And then at some point, I would just take a couple buses. Sometimes the train. It really kind of just depended on what I was in the mood for, honestly. Because I love the tea, but sometimes, some certain things were easier than others, and depending on the time of the day, and sometimes depending on the day of the week, things were a bit easier. Um, I also didn't have access to a laundry, so I had to find a place to do laundry, and I would do laundry um, even when it started to snow. Snow was brand new to me because growing up in Southern California in a non-snowy place, that was that was really exciting. Um, but yeah, I got to experience snow. I got to experience the fall for the first time. Maybe that should be another story time because I really, for the longest time, have been wanting to experience or had been wanting to experience the fall and the autumn leaves and whatnot. So that was really fun. Um, and yeah, so that was a fun first semester. Everything seemed so, um, I don't know what the word is. Everything seemed so, I don't say perfect because it wasn't. I was living off of $800 a month. My rent was $500. Things were not fun, in that sense, but I got to go to a, baseball game. I started going to a bunch of comedy shows. Um, I don't know, things just felt fun for the first time in my life, I think. And I don't know why exactly, but even though I had just gotten out of some kind of like really hard breakup thing, things seemed fun and um as if there were new opportunities. So that was that was really fun. Um and yeah, by the end of the fall, I was, let's see, when did fall submit? Like December. I don't know if I went back home I think I did. I think I did. I went back home for the holidays. That was fun. But I think spring semester was when things started to feel a bit more, um, not real, but as if I was in a better place. Um, because even though all these really cool things were happening in the fall, there were also some really difficult things that were happening. Um, that class I had mentioned earlier, that was really difficult to deal with. I think I had maybe an incomplete or had some kind of extension on a paper. I really can't remember what it was, but I had until probably the first 2 weeks or the first week of spring to turn in a paper. And that was really hard. I hadn't had a paper that difficult in years, to be honest. And I just felt like I don't know how to do this. Not because I couldn't understand the material, but my brain just, maybe I'm just not an anthropologist, and that's okay. I don't necessarily, if you are an anthropologist, good. I'm jelly. Um, but I think that moment during spring or at the beginning of spring, that was the time where a lot of the imposter syndrome finally actually started to kick in. Um, because prior to that, everybody just seemed so welcoming. Everybody seemed so like enthusiastic. I was very enthusiastic. I felt like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. But then I think just that class um, felt very, and I'm not trying to like throw this professor under the bus, but I felt like I wasn't good enough. Anything I said, anything that you know, maybe this is tea, but they were also the advisor I had at the beginning of the 2 years of the master's program. Um, and I think I know I went to them during office hours, like during orientation weekend. And I introduced myself and I was like, hey, my name is so and so, this is what I'm doing, blah, blah. Mind you, this is a master's program, right? A place where you're able to have some kind of exploration of, the kind of work that you'd like to do if that's something you want to do. Um, and so I knew topics, I knew stuff that I had read and I really liked, but I just didn't know the full extent. I didn't know all the literature. Um, so when this professor, told me, come back to me when you have a question, I was like, I can't even introduce myself, okay? And it was harder because this professor identified as a Latinx professor, and that was really challenging to hear. And, being Chicana, and, not that I always told everybody I was Chicana, but, it just hit differently. And when I took their class, I thought, oh, things would be different. Maybe they were just having an off day, and I took their class, and it just seemed like couldn't get anything right. Participated, not participated. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything right, and so yeah. So the camera went out on me. So where was I? I was talking about the professor and the class that made me feel like I wasn't good enough. That added to having to submit a late paper. I think that's what it was. I think I either took that or an incomplete. It felt like I was not good enough. It felt like I just was not good enough, and I that's where I was going into the spring. So I guess we'll transition into spring. Um, but I think a lot of what spring turned out to be was finally me coming to terms with I got here because I worked my butt off, because I found a field, what is it called? Major um, concentration, whatever you want to call it. I found something that was going to be, or that turned out to be something I really enjoyed. I really loved. I really loved studying about different world traditions, and I loved learning about my own, um, you know, Christianity in its various forms, Catholicism in its various forms. So I had to come back to that, and I had to come back to this space of no, like I earned this. I belong here. Not only do I belong here, they need me. Harvard needs me more than I need them, So, because at some point I realized not that I was the only brown girl in the class, but that maybe it was important for me to say stuff. um, because not everybody was going to have my, understanding of a reading, or, you know, perspective on a reading, or a conversation that we're having in seminar. And let me tell you, those seminars, those were crazy. Yeah, at some point during fall semester, I spoke to a professor, my my favorite professor, during office hours, and I was like, "Hey, so in seminar, in class, I don't understand what's going on. Like, I know you said read this book, and we're going to talk about it, but I don't know what people are talking about." Just because I think there's the climate in a seminar at Harvard that I saw was very much like everybody's trying to say something. And not only is everybody trying to say something, everybody's trying to like say the smartest thing. And possibly because everybody is smart, right? Like, but also sometimes it's not. Or sometimes it just, from an outsider, because I was new to the Harvard thing, it felt like, whoa, it felt really disorienting. So I had to, talk to that professor, and I was like, what do I do? Like, I want to do really well, and I love the things that we're learning. Um, but like, how do I, like, imagine playing, what is it called? Double Dutch? Is that what that is? The one where you have the two jump ropes and you have to like go in at some point. I was trying to figure out when to go in. And so I told him, I was like, how do I make some kind of contribution to this course? And so he was like very insightful. And basically, he told me that some of it is performative, and not because they're trying to be performative, but just because it's just the nature of the Harvard thing. Um, because everybody's so smart, or at least like that's what the idea of a Harvard student is, or a grad student at Harvard, right? You're smart, you know stuff, like you're reading everything all the time. Um, you read all of the things, you're insightful, you're, you know, brilliant, and all this other stuff. And yes, it's true, but at the same time, it can be overwhelming or like intimidating, um, especially if those are new spaces. And that was definitely a new space for me, because prior to that, um, it was just not the same. It was not the same. So, yeah, he was like, ask questions. If somebody's saying this and that and the other, ask, what do you mean by that? Or like, my understanding of such and such thing is blah blah blah. Like, is that what you're also thinking? Um, because he's like, when we go in on that kind of level where we're trying to break things down and we're trying to question things, it feels a bit more approachable. And I was like, all right. So I kind of took that into consideration, and I think that kind of was the basis for my attitude in the spring, right? It was that feeling of like, no, I worked my butt off to get here. I was doing XYZ extracurriculars during my undergrad. I studied, I took my exams, I went to office hours, I, you know, got an academic achievement award for my department, like I was putting in the work. And even on top of that, I was going to lectures, not even because they were asked of me, but because I genuinely wanted to learn. I genuinely was hungry for knowledge, and that's literally what I did during undergrad. And, the years before, but I think even more so during undergrad because there were more opportunities. Compared to the community colleges, there's more research at a four-year institution. And so therefore more opportunities to immerse yourself in, a lecture, go to a symposium, attend a, conference, if you can. And thankfully, because I was in religious studies department, that was pretty well known. We had a lot of folks do guest lectures, and we had guest speakers, and we also had a religious studies club, which, president. But like, we got to do some cool stuff, and we got to visit some cool sacred sites, and a lot of that was me run, right, along with some of my, classmates and peers. But a lot of that was me. And so when I got to the Harvard, I realized, or at least spring semester, I was like, why am I being so hard on myself when I deserve to be here? I deserved, oh my gosh, I'm gonna cry. I deserve to take up space. I deserve to um, be in these spaces that could absolutely use someone like me and her perspective, right? So, um, it turned into that kind of it was my Elle Woods type of moment where she goes from like, I'll show you what Elle Woods could do, to that like montage of her getting all her work done. And that's kind of what it felt like. I started I remember spring break because I did not go home. I stayed in Cambridge or Boston, and I can't remember where I was living at the time. I moved so much during the course of like 3 years. It's not even funny. But like at some point, I was living in Hyde Park, and then at some point, I moved to Revere. That was probably spring 2017, and then lived in Cambridge on one side of the river at the business school of all places, and then I lived two other places in Cambridge. At some point during like 2018, 2019. Um, excuse me. But yes, so I I moved around a lot, so I can't remember where I lived at, any given place. But um, spring was the time that I stayed in Boston, and I was at the library every single day. Widener Library was my jam. That's where I went. Love the Divinity School, but it was just easier for me to go to Widener Library. Plus, it was easier for me to like get lost in Widener Library, but not and like get lost, but like focus, get lost in my own thoughts, get lost in my work. And every day during spring break, I would go in at like around 9, um, and I'd do just like a brain dump, just type out all the stuff, all the things I needed to say, um, that were not academic, and then get into my work, do the readings I had to do, and finish that paper. I think that's why it stood out to me the most, because I was like, I need to get this done. I'm gonna get this done, and not only that, but I I can do this. And so yeah, I started to do that. And sometimes I had extra time or wanted to take a break, so I started looking up other stuff. And a lot of that turned into my own personal, research interests and diving deeper into those. Um, and then, yeah, so spring semester, I took the second half of that, what is it, that biography class. I took a bunch of other classes that I took a class with Dr. Cornell West. I don't know if y'all remember in that first video I mentioned how he was super influential to my learning as a 18, 19, 20 year old. Mostly I'd say 19, 20. But I had even gone so far as to buy his like spoken word album, and I finally got to take a class with him in spring, and I went to his office hours, which was crazy because I'm like, it took a minute. It wasn't just one of those like you come on in, or I guess maybe it was, but it felt like it took a while for me to finally get to see him. It was a class on American democracy, and it was probably easily 200 students. It was a gigantic class. But I finally got to meet him, and when I talked to him, I was just like, I basically told him how I got to Harvard and all this stuff, and how he was influential, and how I'd, purchased his spoken word album. And he looks at his bookshelf and he goes, "Which one? I have three." I was like, I didn't know that. Oh my gosh, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. So um, that was probably the highlight of spring, honestly. And finally feeling like, no, no, I belong here. I am more than capable of doing this work. I have dreams, goals still, because I think at the div school, and I think possibly because they're trying to be very honest and real with us about, job prospects, because a lot of folks, I don't know, it we just, I think, have to be honest about work after academia, or with an MTS degree or an MDiv degree. And so I think they really hammered in us like, just make sure you're able to pivot if you need to, because not everybody's going to get into a PhD program after this. And so much of hearing that, every single time that I'd hear that, I was like, no, that's the goal. That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah, so they would hammer us with, you know, it might not be that you end up in a PhD program after this. And so I really had to, one, consider that, because maybe it's possible. Maybe I'm not going to end up in a PhD program after this. But also, I didn't want to diminish or dismiss my ambition or goals or dreams, because I did feel like the PhD was going to be for me. Um, at least in that moment, I was like, this is it. This is for me. Um, and the more that I kept doing this kind of work, the more I felt like, yeah, this is for me. And then after that, it was summer. I took that. I think I spent that summer in. Yeah, I did. I spent that summer in Boston, and I worked. I worked that summer. I got a job working in the city. Um, and it was like through one of those tourist companies. I won't get into details, but it was a tourist company, and I started that in the spring 2017. And I will say it was non-academic. It wasn't a, big company. It was well known. It was well known for its tours. But I actually really enjoyed it, even though it was hard sometimes because a lot of it had to be manual labor. Um, and being out in the hot sun, um, and the humidity, which I kind of really enjoyed. But I think I enjoyed it because it meant that I could step away from the Harvard bubble. Because one thing that I realized about Harvard was that if you don't have something like a piece of yourself that's grounded. But yeah, if you don't have, or if I didn't have a piece of myself grounded in identity and who I was prior to Harvard, then I feel like I could have easily just been, and just because so much, well, I don't want to say so much, but I can see how someone being in like the Ivy League bubble or like the Harvard bubble for too long can sometimes then end up with the attitude of like, I'm better than you and I know more than you. And because I have an Ivy League education, like I'm somehow more, you know, valuable as a human being than you are. So I, I think one way that I was able to push away from that kind of behavior or attitude was working off campus that had nothing to do with academia. And number two, um, really having an idea of who I was before I went there. And so I spent all summer working. I spent my off days at um, at the library, at Widener Library. It was my favorite place in the whole world, and I would just be there 9 to 5 every day. Uh, maybe not every day because I had work every day, or the schedule was set up in a way that I got a few days off, and then those off days I would be at the library, and then sometimes after work I would show up to the library. But all of it really was kind of to take inventory of all the literature I didn't have time to read because, right, I was taking all these classes on American democracy and race and gender and the history of Islam and all these other things that weren't necessarily around my topic. Because I really wanted to get into like Latinx religion, and the closest thing I got there was Latina theory, being a knowing, but it was, I don't know, it just didn't feel exactly like what I was trying to do. So I spent that whole summer just trying to, uh, what's the word? Uh, just trying to, I created a syllabus, and every single week I would go through, certain books, certain articles, certain chapters. And from there, I started to build my own, what's the word? Uh, project, like an individual project. And I think that came in handy because I think in the fall I was able to take a class. Oh, I guess this is part fall now. So yeah, fall quarter or fall semester, I took a part one to the class that would set up my paper for what my dissertation topic is now. So that really came in handy. Um, Fall 2017, I also went to a conference that was important within my field, and I got to meet a scholar who how do I say this? Not that I read so much, but like after reading all that summer, I finally got to meet one of the authors. Um, and it was honestly just by chance. I was at a panel, not on a panel, but just like in the audience, and someone introduced us, and they were like, "Oh, so what are you studying?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm doing this." And um, it then turned into a conversation about like, "Hey, yeah, we have some of his archival material at our institution." And I was like, "Oh." And they're like, "Yeah, see if the such and such center can, you know, might have some kind of grant or something for you to, you know, travel." And I was like, "Oh, well, I'll take a look." And so I did, and I applied for that travel grant. And oh my gosh, all these little fuzzies. Um, and I did. I applied to that travel grant, and um, it's funny because it wasn't for master's students; it was for PhD students and or faculty. Um, but I was like, I'll just apply. I think I emailed them and I was like, hey, can I apply for this? And they were like, I don't see why not. So then I applied to that. And they, like, at some point interviewed me once I got there. And they put up the interview on their website or whatever. And, like, it was a whole thing. It felt so ceremonial. I was like, okay. But I got to go to the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, and I was there for 2 weeks in spring 2018. Um, and we can, I guess, start talking about spring. But I think spring was interesting because that was my last semester, and I knew that it was going to be my last semester, so I tried my hardest to get all of, as much access to their, I guess, student. Um, I don't know, like as a student, you had access to so much stuff via their library, and so I tried my hardest to get access to all the things that I could. I still have access to it now as an alumna, but it's limited, but it's limited. So even visiting the library there, like you have to go through a whole process. But I knew that my time there was coming to an end, so I did everything I could in my power to just access the library as much as I could, the library website as much as I could, because was it the interloan library system? It was something, but I was able to have like a bunch of newspapers scanned, and those were like the primary sources that I used for my now master's thesis. Um, so I started, I wonder, at some point I might go through some of the stuff that I have, but um, a lot of it was just newspapers and, documents and folders. And then maybe for another story time, I could do my time at the University of Notre Dame and their archives and working in an archive. Not working, but, doing the archival work. Um, and that was fun. So yeah, spring came and went. By the time I knew it, I was graduating. I think I graduated May 2018. I knew that when did I apply to grad school or PhD? Was it that time around? I can't remember when I applied. It might have been that time around that I applied. I think maybe it was 2019. I think I finished my spring semester and then I applied, the fall after, because early 2019, I think that's when I found out that I didn't get into a program. Um, so there's that. Um, I think that's what it was. Honestly, I can't remember. Because I know there's no way I applied fall 2017. I don't think. Anyways, the point is, I finished strong in spring 2018, and um, I felt sad because my family couldn't join me. Bunch of different reasons we don't need to get into, but um, it was really sad because I didn't have my family at my Harvard graduation. I didn't have anybody there. I did have um, my uh, friend from undergrad who was in the area. She was, I think, in New Jersey at the time, and she's like, "I'll come visit you." And I was like, "Okay." So I have her, um, and she was just so sweet. We went out for food afterwards, and um, it just was really, really nice. Um, but that was also really sad to realize that so much of my Harvard journey at that point had been by myself. Like, yeah, I had friends and yeah, I even dated, but like a lot of it was just myself. A lot of it was just in conversation with me. Like, the days that I had in the library, they were just days where I didn't have, like, not that I didn't have anybody to talk to, it's just that I didn't have like a community of scholars who I could talk to. Um, and the people that I've met along the way, thank God for them, because I don't think I could do scholarship or research by myself. Because there are sometimes things that I want to read and I just want to talk to somebody about it, and it doesn't have to be a big old thing about, oh, they're going to take my ideas and da 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 da, but just to like debrief, because sometimes, oh my god, all the fuzzies are just flying around. Um, but sometimes it's just I want to talk to somebody about, hey, I found this really cool thing in the archive today, or like, hey, what do you think about, this article or whatever? Have you read such and such book? That's really interesting, or, stuff like that. And it was always really difficult to find some kind of talking partner that would be able to do that. So it was a lot of the Harvard was isolating, and spring 2018 made me realize how isolating it was. Um, and I think after that, um, I stayed in Boston. I was living in Cambridge by then. And then I just continued to live. I continued to do, just work. I got a second job at a restaurant near campus, and I also really love that. Like, highly recommend getting a non-academic job, just because I don't know, it's helpful. I felt grounded. I felt not to, diss anybody from my Harvard friends. This is, if you're my Harvard friend, like, this is not about you. Um, but I think so much of my experience at Harvard, and I guess these are my final thoughts, but so much of the Harvard experience for me was a very isolating one. It was very lonely. Um, Geez, all I do is cry on here. But a lot of it was lonely and isolating. And I think the only times that I felt like somebody was there or present, or um, simply just acknowledging my presence, a lot of it came from like the folks who did the, janitorial work, the cafeteria workers, the, security guards, the my coworkers at the restaurant, the cooks, the cashiers, the folks who I worked with in the tourist company, um, the drivers, the the other college students that I worked with. And I think they were oh my gosh, oof, I knew I was always within the working class, but like I never felt more connected to the working class um, as much as I did when I was there. And they they really came through, and they really made me feel like all I do is cry, y'all. Like fast forward. God, cut the show. All I, yeah, all I do is cry. But I just felt like for them, it didn't matter if I had a Harvard degree. It didn't matter if I had, a master's. None of that mattered. What mattered is that I was kind and caring and compassionate, and they would do the same. So, um, that's kind of what I needed. And the church, and the church. Um, I would have to go to, oh my gosh, is it the Church of the Annunciation? I don't know. Don't get mad at me. I have to Google this now. Um, one of the churches near, it's off of Central Square. I can't remember the street. Um, but I had to go to that church because they had, ¿cómo se llama? They had mass in Spanish, and I just needed to hear Spanish. I got so happy whenever I'd hear people just blasting their reggaeton, or like hearing somebody on the subway, like, speaking in Spanish. There were a few times where folks came up to me and they were like, "Hey, are you Peruvian?" I was just like, "Nope." I wish I was, but I'm not. And so, yeah, it was super, super lonely, super isolating. I had to make sure that Saint Mary, that's what it was, Saint Mary of the Annunciation. Why do I feel like I'm saying that incorrectly? But those folks, shout out to them. Also, shout out to the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center because I ended up volunteering for them at some point as a speaker, and that was always a near and dear thing to my heart that I got to, or speaking with as one of their speakers was such a cherished event for me because I did that a couple times at Boston College, Northeastern, and it just those times that I got to share stuff, personal stuff. I think that was always really impactful for me, and it meant that I had a community of people who, you know, uh, who understood where I was coming from. And I didn't have to be this like performative person all the time. And I got to do improv towards the end of my time at in Boston. I got to do some improv. I say end of it because I came back to California in 2019, August 2019, something like that. Um, and I got to do some improv, and I really loved it. And I yeah, I wanted to stay in Boston for longer. I actually had plans to live there for, long term, but those didn't come to fruition in that moment, and that's a different story time. But I love it, and I think I'll end with this note. Um, because at this point, Boston is really near and dear to my heart, partially because of the Harvard thing, but a big portion of it was because, like, oof, if I met you in Boston and you're watching this is for you. But I got to meet folks that have become really close friends, family to some degree, and have also left some kind of impact on just my life. And yeah, it's hard to say that. It's hard to say that. Um, but partially why Boston is so important for me, and it just holds a really, special place in my heart, is because of the folks. That's like 70% of it. Uh, the other percent, um, I'd say maybe like, what is it, 20%, I'd say was a Harvard thing. The other 10% was the weather. I loved the snow, and because I had never been in snow before, like not to that degree, and the fall. The fall was absolutely my favorite thing ever because I think when I was in high school, I think it was either my freshman year or my sophomore year. I think it was going into my sophomore year. I remember going into we had a room that was full of like college stuff, college material, SAT prep books, and, you know, college brochures, and just so many books on how to get to college and, that kind of stuff, right? And I remember going through some of the pamphlets, and I saw one that had a bunch of, leaves on it from like the fall. And it was a pamphlet for Princeton University. And I looked through it and I was like, ooh, I want to go there. But it's not, how do I say this? I wanted to go to Princeton because of the fall, not because of like Princeton, because I didn't understand Princeton like that. And so I told my guidance counselor, I was like, yeah, I want to go to Princeton, because she was asking us about our plans, moving forward. And she's like, she took off her glasses and she was like, all right, well, let's be realistic, and, let's have a different kind of plan. And I think from then on, like, not that my world shattered, but I felt like, what do you mean? Like, aren't you my guidance counselor? Like, are we supposed to then make a plan for this? Like, even if you think it's outrageous and crazy. Um, and so, she was very much like, let's apply to, some of the state schools, and let's do that first. And I was just like, and it's, funny looking back because I don't know, like, what was that? When did that happen? Like maybe 2005, when 2015 came around and I was like doing the Harvard thing. I remember we were still in touch because I was working at my high school, at the old high school, and, as a tutor. And I remember at some point having a conversation with her in her office 10 years later. And, I told her, I was like, yeah, it might not be Princeton, but, Harvard isn't so bad. And she was just like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know if she said I knew you could do it or something, but by then I was just like, I don't know, I felt so weird because I was like, here's this person who just, for whatever reason, maybe thought my dreams were too crazy, or like, you know, maybe I was just, just too ambitious, or I don't know what she thought of me. But at 15 years old, but then at 25, knowing that, or I guess by then it was like 2016, but 10 years, whatever later, like here I was going to grad school at Harvard, and I think that is part of, I think what made Harvard even more special, was that I had a lot of folks who just did not believe in my capabilities for grad school. I had friends who were just outright like, why would you want to go to grad school? Like, that's just more thinking. It's going to be really hard, And I was just like, well, duh. Like, and then, guidance counselors who didn't think I was Ivy League, material. And yeah. And then I graduated and I'm doing a PhD at another top, school. So, it, I love wearing the Harvard badge just because, and honestly, I didn't even think of this, but this is kind of, Harvard color. But, I wear it as a badge of honor. I survived it. I survived Harvard. I survived all the things. And now I think when people tell me like, hey, I want to go to Harvard, or I want to go to grad school, or I want to do this, I'm like, do it. Let's go. Let's find a plan. Because I'll end with this, because I think I already said I'll end with this, but I'll really, really end with this. I never want to be in a position to, you know, diminish or dismiss someone else's dreams. I never want to do that. Will never be me. No. Um, I might be concerned, like, oh, how are you going to do that? Like, like, how are you going to do, XYZ? But I never want to be the person to like just tell someone outright, like, no, what are you thinking? Or let's pick something safe. And I understand like picking safe, right? But like just to flat out tell someone no, um, it just doesn't sit with me well anymore. So not that it ever did, but I think even more so now. So, anyways, that was my experience. I feel like I got to a lot of points. But if you have any other questions, let me know. Um, yeah, hopefully we'll have another story time at some point. I love these story times. So, anyways, bye.